and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Trish Secca, and I'm the Senior Nutrition Program Manager at IFINS, the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Scientists. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about IFINS. IFINS, for those not familiar, is a nonprofit organization focused on advancing food and nutrition science for public benefit. This is done by bringing together scientists from government, industry, and academia to identify areas of common interest and develop projects to advance science in those areas. As an organization, IFINS funds research and convenes experts to deliver a variety of products to include competitively funded research, workshops, dialogues, and peer-reviewed publications. This particular webinar results from research supported by the Low and No Calorie Sweetener Committee, which seeks to develop and communicate the science related to the role of low and no calorie sweeteners in health and disease. During the webinar, if you wish to ask a question, please click on the question button at the top of the GoToWebinar panel and enter your question in the box below. Questions are only visible to IFINS staff, and we will address your questions at the end of the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. Kelly Higgins is a clinical nutrition scientist at Exponent with 10 years of experience evaluating the complex relationships between diet, behavior, and health. Dr. Higgins is an ingestive behavior expert with specialized experience investigating the multidisciplinary study of why people eat what they eat, when they eat it, and how this affects health. Her technical skills include experimental design and management of clinical trials, biostatistics, and systematic review methodology. Prior to Exponent, Dr. Higgins was a nutrition scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Research Service, Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center, Food Components and Health Laboratory. It was in this role that she completed the research that will be presented today. In line with her interest in energy balance and obesity, she led numerous systematic reviews to synthesize evidence and draw conclusions of various complex diet and body weight-related outcomes, including the reviews focused on sweetness, low-calorie sweeteners, portion size, ingested frequency, and chrononutrition. Please welcome Dr. Higgins.
Thanks so much, Trish, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. For those of you familiar with research on low-calorie sweeteners or just nutrition research in general, are not surprised to hear that different reviews often come to different conclusions. We often attribute this to differences in review quality, and it's just par for the course for conducting research. However, the general public still ends up confused about what foods or dietary patterns they should follow and which ones to avoid. The results from these conflicting reviews can influence the dietary guidance that is developed for low-calorie sweeteners and body weight and other nutrition exposures, particularly whenever they are based off of evidence from systematic reviews. So instead of just taking this evidence as par for the course, we wanted to understand really why these different reviews are coming to different conclusions, whether we can tease out differences in the methodology to see how these different methods could influence the evidence that is pooled and the conclusions that were drawn. The results that I'm about to present here today come from a recent publication that is in Advances in Nutrition that I published along with my former coworkers at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We really wanted to sit down and tease through these differences, come up with a systematic way of reviewing this evidence to really determine how these different reviews do end up producing disparate results. So we'll just dive right in. First, just a very quick overview on low-calorie sweeteners. Low-calorie sweeteners are distinct compounds that are all sweet but contribute little to no energy. Think of things like saccharin, sucralose, aspartame. Those are some of the common sweeteners found in the food supply. These low-calorie sweeteners go by many different names, but they're all of the sweeteners that are found in the food that we consume are generally recognized as safe. Despite their safety, the general public is still pretty skeptical on the efficacy of low-calorie sweeteners for body weight management because of the conflicting headlines that they see, whether these low-calorie sweeteners may be helpful or harmful for body weight management. In order to develop dietary recommendations for low-calorie sweeteners or really any dietary exposure, we need to understand the causal relationship between exposure X and outcome Y. In this context, we're talking about exposure to low-calorie sweeteners and body weight as our own. In order to develop dietary recommendations, we need to understand whether there's a causal relationship between low-calorie sweeteners and body weight, whether low-calorie sweeteners are beneficial and can lead to enhanced body weight maintenance, whether they can have detrimental effects on body weight, leading to increases over time, or really there's no effect at all whenever these sweeteners are consumed as part of our complex diet. In order to understand whether a causal relationship does exist, there are different types of study designs that we can use to evaluate this association. Like with the scientific method, we always start with observation to really understand what sorts of hypotheses should be tested in a randomized controlled trial. Different observational evidence can come from non-randomized studies like cross-sectional studies, case control studies, or prospective cohort studies, the best of which that can track individuals over time. I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the non-randomized studies that have been conducted looking at low-calorie sweeteners and body weight. We're not going to focus too much on the results, but really just the context of what data is captured and what questions are being asked. So what I have to present here are some initial results from the Pawtucket Heart Health Program, which was a prospective cohort study that tracked how changes in different nutrients and food additives were associated with 4-year weight change. This sort of study is very common for observational studies looking at low-calorie sweeteners. They tend to look at higher versus lower levels of intake. In this particular example, they focus specifically on intake of saccharin, a specific low-calorie sweetener. And what they found was cross-sectionally, at baseline, intake of saccharin was associated with higher body weight. So from the get-go, these individuals consuming higher levels have higher body weight. It's difficult to tease out what's the chicken or egg here, whether the intake of saccharin leads to increase in body weight, or whether individuals with higher body weight seeking to manage their body weight tend to use low-calorie sweeteners as a sugar alternative to reduce energy intake. And while they saw an association at baseline and a trend for increased body weight when tracked over a 4-year period, whenever they controlled for additional covariates, this association went away. So this sort of result is fairly common for some of our preliminary non-randomized studies on low-calorie sweeteners. We see a difference between these groups at baseline, but it's really difficult to understand why these individuals may be consuming these sweeteners, and they tend to look at this intake at a single time point, so we can't track changes in consumption over a time period. Not to say that other studies haven't done that. This presents here results from the Nurses' Health Study 1 and 2 in the Health Physicians Follow-Up Study, which pooled data to see whether changing beverage intake could actually lead to changes in body weight. So whether swapping out a energetic beverage for a non-energetic beverage could result in changes over time. And like I mentioned, we're not here to focus on the results from these studies, but to really highlight that there's different ways that we can use observational evidence to develop hypotheses about the potential association between low-calorie sweeteners and body weight, and that each specific study that has been conducted is designed to test a specific question. The results from the Pawtucket study were designed to look at the prospective association between saccharin intake, a specific sweetener, and body weight change, while the results from the other study are looking at how changes in beverage intake and how they swap for one another can change body weight. So while this evidence can help us support an association or develop hypotheses that we could test, they're really designed to ask very specific and different questions. That was just a very brief overview of non-randomized studies and how we can use that evidence to develop hypotheses. There's much more rigorous methods available out there that can be used to help inform causal inference between nutrition and other exposures and health outcomes. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I encourage you to tune into an upcoming webinar on September 25th by Andrew Brown, who's going to do a much thorough dive into this. So to go back to our question of causality, for some nutrition exposures, we're limited to evidence from non-randomized studies. Sometimes it's just not possible to test an association between a dietary exposure and something like cancer risk. But luckily for us, it is possible to conduct a randomized control trial to investigate the effect of low-calorie sweetener intake on body weight. And these studies have been done. These studies tend to test one of three hypotheses. So each study is designed to test a very specific mechanism. The first hypothesis that tends to be studied in randomized control trials looking at low-calorie sweeteners and body weight is the energy reduction hypothesis. So this is comparing low-calorie sweeteners that have little to no energy to a sweetness match control that contains energy, something like sugars, sucrose, honey, etc. The second type of hypothesis that is tested is the sweetness hypothesis. So it's really not looking at the sweetener per se, but sweetness in general. So in these studies, they tend to compare a low-calorie sweeteners to water to test the effect of sweetness on body weight. And lastly, there's a group of studies that are sweetener specific. These test specific post-ingestive consequences of specific low-calorie sweeteners because they are all different in structure, bind to different receptors, and have different metabolic fates that could all have downstream consequences for how they affect body weight. So each of these studies that we have that have been conducted that are randomized control trials on low-calorie sweeteners and body weight test one of three hypotheses, and based on these hypotheses, ends up being a very different study design. I'm just going to show you a few very brief examples of these sorts of studies. What I have presented here are results from two long-term randomized control trials. Both were at least a year in duration. Both were weight loss interventions, but they're designed to test different hypotheses. This first study here on the left was designed to look at the effect of aspartame compared to no aspartame, using something like a sugar for control. And then the results on the right are testing more of that sweetness hypothesis and are comparing intake of low-calorie sweetened beverages to intake of water. And so while at face value, these are both weight loss interventions looking at low-calorie sweeteners, but they end up designing a study based on the hypothesis that they're testing. So this is kind of our energy reduction hypothesis and our sweetness hypothesis being tested, but there also have been randomized control trials looking at the sweetener specific effect. Here I have results presented from a 12-week randomized control trial that I conducted along with Rick Mattis. And what we found here was that sweeteners themselves actually have a different effect on body weight, with intake of saccharin over a 12-week period actually contributed to weight gain that was no different than intake of sucrose, whereas individuals consuming sucralose actually observed a decrease in body weight relative to these other sweeteners that were consumed. So these three studies are just three examples of how you can be testing the effect of low-calorie sweeteners on body weight, but end up designing a very different trial. So now we've talked about how we can use non-randomized studies to help us generate hypotheses and test those hypotheses with a randomized controlled trial. But there's another way that we can compile this evidence, and and that is through the use of a systematic review and or meta-analysis. So just some quick background on systematic reviews. The goal of systematic reviews is to synthesize evidence that is addressing a similar question. So what is the effect of exposure X on outcome Y? A systematic review uses a priori pre-specified eligibility criteria to systematically compile evidence and then review it in a systematic way. One way of conducting quantitative evidence synthesis is with the use of a meta-analysis, which is the statistical combination of results from two or more separate studies. Like any other statistical tool, a meta-analysis requires some basic assumptions to be met in order to produce meaningful and unbiased results. So meta-analyses really only require two studies, so you could really pool two completely different studies within a meta-analysis, but in order to produce meaningful results, we need to have all the primary studies included to be measuring the same effect. And it's important that all of the studies are a representative sample of all studies conducted, so that we're not biasly selecting a certain group of studies and excluding others, which could bias our results in one way or another. So in the best case scenario, all of the primary studies included within a meta-analysis should be an unbiased representation of the general population or the target population. So if you're interested specifically on children, you should be including just studies on children. The independent and dependent variables should be identically defined and measured. And the experimental design and duration of each study should be the same. In the best case scenario, there's no complicating factors that could affect one study and not the other, such as something like a concomitant intervention like a weight loss intervention or physical activity. And lastly, there should be a sufficient number of studies in order to produce these meaningful results. So I've brought up a lot about non-randomized studies, randomized controlled trials, and how we can synthesize this evidence with a systematic review and meta-analysis. So why does this all matter? This matters because the type of evidence that is pooled and used in evidence synthesis can have implications for the results from the systematic review and how those results can be interpreted. Recently, the World Health Organization came up with dietary guidance regarding the use of low-calorie sweeteners, and they based this recommendation off of results from meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials as well as non-randomized studies. What they found in their systematic review was that randomized controlled trials tended to observe that low-calorie sweeteners could be beneficial for weight management, particularly when substituted for sugars. However, results from non-randomized studies tended to observe adverse associations between long-term intake of low-calorie sweeteners and body weight. Therefore, the World Health Organization ended up making a recommendation that low-calorie sweeteners should not be used for maintaining and achieving body weight based on the results from the meta-analyses of non-randomized studies. But given how different these studies are from each other, we started to question, is this the best way of synthesizing the evidence? And can these meta-analyses really produce a result that can be consistently estimated? All of the primary evidence that is pooled together as part of these meta-analysis is asking a very specific question. They recruit specific populations, use specific interventions and comparators to test their hypothesis. Their duration can vary widely, and some can be consumed as part of a weight loss intervention or not, all of which can have effects, produce heterogeneity, and really can make it difficult to draw conclusions from this highly heterogeneous data set. So we decided, instead of just postulating these questions, we wanted to go out and test it. So we conducted an overview of reviews, which is a systematic review of reviews to determine how the different methodologies used in systematic reviews influence our findings, and whether a meta-analysis results can provide a consistent estimated effect. We use low-calorie sweeteners and body weight as a case study, but really these results could be applied to many other dietary exposures when the results from a randomized controlled trial and non-randomized study don't quite line up. So like with any systematic review, we developed a set of PICOS criteria to help us systematically screen and identify reviews to include and assess. We wanted to broadly capture any systematic review or meta-analysis that had been previously published. So we pulled from systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials or non-randomized studies. We didn't really restrict based on the population, health status, or age. Included intake of any type of low-calorie sweetener, whether it was consumed alone or in combination with other foods, beverages, or energetic sweeteners. And we didn't include any restriction based on duration. Could include any comparator, but we wanted to include studies that looked specifically at measures of adiposity. So this could include broadly body weight, BMI, waist circumference, etc. So we conducted our initial search back in November of 2022, and we ended up identifying a total of 20 systematic reviews that we would further evaluate as part of our overview of reviews. Within these 20 reviews, we systematically extracted data, independently extracted by 2 reviewers independently. We extracted a lot of information about study methods, the results observed, and conclusions drawn. And for the sake of today's presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on the different PICOS criteria that were used in these reviews we identified, the primary studies that were included, their meta-analysis results, and their overall conclusions from the review based on the evidence that they synthesized. So I'm going to cut straight to our overall conclusion because, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So what we have here are the systematic review conclusions of the association between low-calorie sweeteners and body weight from our 20 reviews that we identified. We have them classified based on the type of evidence that was synthesized, whether they considered randomized control trials, prospective cohort, or case control studies. That's what's going across the x-axis here. We then graphed the overall conclusion drawn from the reviews based on the evidence that they pulled, and the side, which is the color of the bubble, and the size of the bubble represents the number of studies reviewed within each review. So in general, at face value, you can really see here that systematic reviews that assessed randomized controlled trials tended to observe that low-calorie sweeteners may decrease body weight or be more beneficial or have a neutral effect, whereas reviews that looked at prospective cohort or case control studies tended to include that low-calorie sweeteners had an adverse effect on body weight. So just looking at reviews based on the type of evidence that's being pulled, we can really clearly see that we're drawing very different conclusions, whether you're considering experimental randomized controlled trials or non-randomized studies. So we want to go a little bit bigger detail to see why these conclusions may have been drawn. So we developed these Sankey plots, which represent the proportion of studies included within each review. So the width of each track indicates the proportion of studies being included within each review. And as you can see, there was considerable lack of overlap between studies included within each review. And we wanted to really further understand why. Why are these big differences? We thought there'd be a lot of overlap between some of these big high quality reviews, but we didn't see that what we're expecting. So we developed some additional tools to help us further track this evidence. We have, in addition to the figures included in our publication in advances, we also developed some online interactive tools to help not only ourselves, but everyone else better understand where are these studies going? Why are they being included and excluded? And just be able to track those better. So what we have here is in our online interactive figures, we have a similar style of SYNC graph where we have the different reviews on the right and the individual primary study here on the left. The width of the track indicates how many studies were included within each review. So you can start to see what there are certain studies that are included more often than others. The tracks in the blue represent randomized control trials. The tracks in orange represent non-randomized studies. So we felt that this was a complicated yet useful tool to really show where are these studies going and help you see when a study might be included in one review but not in another. So the differences in the number and types of studies included within a review can depend on a couple of different features. First and foremost is the when a study was published. You know, if a review was published earlier when the study, it's not going to be identified, and that's okay. But we'd also observed that depending on the primary aim and corresponding inclusion criteria, resulted in different studies being pulled into some reviews but not others. And really, some of these features can actually be beneficial for improving the quality of the review. So just because a review doesn't include every single possible study doesn't mean it's bad. Some of them restricted based on duration. You know, if you're looking at low-calorie sweeteners and body weight, it probably is appropriate to have some sort of cutoff to determine sufficient study duration if you're really understanding what is the effect of a low-calorie sweetener on body weight when consumed long-term. So these different reviews had different aims. Some of them looked at all low-calorie sweeteners. Some focused specifically on low-calorie sweetened beverages. Others focused on specific sweeteners. All of that affects what studies get pulled into what review. So I encourage you to take a look at our online interactive figures if you want to have a better idea of how these studies, these primary studies, track with one another. So that gives us a little idea of why these different reviews have different size of bubbles. Briefly, I want to talk just about review quality, because we did see differences in quality. I don't want to spend this time telling you about all the really good and bad things that each review did, but I wanted to focus on a few key characteristics that I think make a systematic review set apart from others and really give a better idea of what is going on between low-calorie sweeteners and body weight. The first feature of a systematic review that I wanted to point out was subgroup and sensitivity analyses. Some reviews did more than others, but I really want to highlight the World Health Organization's review because I think they did a really good job of developing a priori sensitivity analyses to better understand this. Instead of pooling all these highly heterogeneous studies, which they did, they then broke it out further to investigate specific characteristics. So things like the specific sweetener that was tested. They also investigated differences between the comparator, whether the baseline body weight status, as well as whether or not a study was a weight loss intervention study. So these subgroup and sensitivity analysis, I think, can be really helpful when can be really helpful for understanding these sources of heterogeneity. All right, the next characteristic of some of these systematic reviews was particularly focused on the systematic reviews and meta-analyses of non-randomized studies. Like I mentioned earlier, typically non-randomized studies just compare higher versus lower intake or assess intake of sweeteners at a specific single time. But this review, led by Jennifer Lee and colleagues in Toronto, I think did a really good job of teasing out the substitution or change effects in low-calorie sweeteners and how that influences body weight, to really kind of get a better understanding of what is going on and how those dietary changes can correspond to changes in body weight. So for this, I applaud their attempt to really look beyond just high-low and look more at the substitution and change effects. So like we've mentioned, we focus mostly on the overall conclusions, the quality of the reviews, and the number of studies included within each review. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the actual meta-analysis results that were drawn from these reviews. So among the reviews that conducted a meta-analysis, we decided to graph all of these results together in one figure. So we developed figures here that show the mean difference and standardized mean difference in body weight, or BMI, from meta-analyses of randomized control trials. And then the next slides I'll show you are the results from non-randomized studies. So these different panels show you the mean difference or standardized mean difference in body weight, or just since it's a little difficult to take this all in, let's just focus in on the results from meta-analyses looking at mean difference in body weight and standardized mean difference in body weight. We grouped these meta-analysis results based on the type of comparison because we know coming into this, we're probably going to see differences when you're comparing low-calorie sweeteners to sugar, which have energy, to low-calorie sweeteners to water or nothing, which has little to no. And what you can see here is that very consistently, despite these differences in reviews and the number and type of studies that they're pulling in, these results consistently demonstrated that low-calorie sweeteners have little to no effect on body weight based on the results from randomized controlled trials. We thought we'd see more difference here between low-calorie sweeteners compared to sucrose, but really just very consistently little to no effect on body weight. I want to point out just briefly the results from the WHO's review. This is one of the more recent ones and more comprehensive, and ended up pooling a total of 29 randomized controlled trials in their assessment. And as far as body weight goes, they observed a significant beneficial effect in that low-calorie sweeteners were beneficial in the direction of benefit of low-calorie sweeteners versus any. So now let's look at the results from the non-randomized studies. These show something very different. Similarly, many of these results observed no effect of low-calorie sweeteners, but particularly whenever you look at the results that were the hazard ratio or risk ratio of obesity, we see a adverse effect of low-calorie sweeteners compared to any comparator, or higher, or not so much any comparator, but that highest versus lower, higher versus lower low-calorie sweetener intake. So just to focus a little bit more on a few of these studies, one of the key differences that we observed was not just the direction of the results from RCTs versus non-randomized studies, but also just the number of studies included within those systematic reviews. While in the randomized controlled trials, while up to 29 RCTs were pooled together within a review, only up to nine randomized studies were pooled with any of these systematic reviews. Just to focus back in on that WHO review, whereas we had 29 randomized controlled trials, we only have up to 5 cohort studies that we could pool together to obtain results observed in that report. And I think that's somewhat it makes you wonder. I think oftentimes we err on the side of considering some of these non-randomized studies because they're longer and they're bigger and they include more people. But if you look at the total number of individuals pooled in the randomized controlled trials, they're on par with the number of individuals pooled in some of these non-randomized meta-analyses of non-randomized studies. And this is the result here that was really what determined the conclusion that low-calorie sweeteners should be avoided. So we're using evidence in which we can't determine a causal relationship that actually has fewer individuals to make very large conclusions about whether or not low-calorie sweeteners should be consumed or avoided. So just some overall conclusions from our systematic, our overview of reviews. What we found was that systematic reviews investigating the effect of low-calorie sweeteners on body weight implement different methodologies to answer similar but different research questions based on their primary aim. And they end up pooling highly heterogeneous primary research. Like we said, each RCT, each non-randomized study is designed to ask a very specific question. And so ending up pooling all these studies really just might not meet those basic assumptions required for a meta-analysis in order to produce a meaningful result. So I really would question whether or not these results should be used. Maybe the direction of effect, but as far as an exact effect estimate, I would consider those with caution. The number of primary studies vary widely across these reviews. Like we said, some of that was because of those inclusion criteria, but we really found that these reviews were not necessarily building off of the evidence pooled from one study versus another, but really kind of just reinventing the wheel and including very, very different studies within each review. Despite these differences, results were generally consistent for meta-analysis results of randomized controlled trials, which indicated that low-calorie sweeteners could be beneficial for body weight management, particularly when compared to sugars, whereas meta-analyses of non-randomized studies tended to observe an adverse or null effect. So just some further research recommendations based on what we found. I don't think conducting more systematic reviews is going to lead the field any closer to understanding whether there is a universal causal relationship or lack thereof between low-calorie sweeteners and body weight. Instead of pooling these highly heterogeneous studies, I think that it's important to really consider why we're observing these different results and embracing that and helping it better understand why or why not we might be observing an effect in one study but not the other. It's more appropriate to rely on high-quality randomized controlled trials designed to test specific hypotheses and mechanisms to explain under what circumstances low-calorie sweetener intake increases, decreases, or has no effect on body weight. I also have some research recommendations for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, because I think they really can be useful for evidence synthesis when done right. And like I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to embrace that heterogeneity and not ignore it. Developing a priori subgroup or sensitivity analysis to better tease out when we may expect to see an effect versus when we don't. And selecting the appropriate evidence synthesis tool for your research question. Meta-analysis may not be appropriate for the question that you're asking. Maybe just a qualitative systematic review, meta-regression, network meta-analysis, or really just pooling the data from individual studies instead of just pooling that effect estimate. There are many different tools that can be used that may be more appropriate than what's just status quo right now. I also encourage individuals to build off of research from previously conducted reviews. We put in a lot of effort to compile all those individual studies that have been done. Use that as a resource. Take a look. Make sure you're capturing those key studies. If you're not, make sure you're being excluded for one of your a priori inclusion criteria. And lastly, these systematic reviews and meta-analyses can be massive. you're pulling in a lot of data from a lot of different sources. So it's really important to have good and strong quality assurance measures to make sure that you're reducing the risk of errors whenever compiling this evidence together, so you can draw more stronger conclusions based on evidence you feel confident about. So while we did a lot of work to explain why these different reviews are coming to different conclusions, there's still a need for developing dietary recommendations based on strong primary evidence that comes from these high quality randomized controlled trials, because they're possible. And I really hope that you can take the information on how to conduct evidence synthesis and those best practices to apply this information into how you interpret evidence from systematic reviews and meta-analyses, how you might conduct these reviews yourselves, and how you may develop dietary recommendations for individuals that you might be helping. So why do systematic reviews come to different conclusions? This is because these previously published systematic reviews attempt to answer what is the estimated effect of low-calorie sweeteners on body weight. They report disparate results because the reviews attempt to synthesize findings from studies that are testing specific but very different research questions. With that, I want to thank all of my co-authors who really helped make this research project possible, as well as our sponsors. This work was conducted while I was at the USDA's Agriculture Research Service, and it was funded in part through IFAN. I want to also thank some of our search string peer reviewers, Catherine Apperton and Marissa Shams-White, as well as some mentors and friends that have helped a lot along the way, particularly Rick Mattis, who gave me a very similar question my very first week of my PhD, asking me to determine why systematic reviews on why systematic reviews on nuts come to different conclusions, as well as guidance I've had from my friend Lauren O'Connor, who, since my very first systematic review, has been a great resource to help sound off ideas to help improve the quality of the reviews that we're conducting. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining and encourage you to attend the sister seminar presented by Andrew Brown. That's going to be a much deeper dive into causal inference, what's possible from non-randomized studies. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We're going to enter into our period of Q&A, and we've had a lot of engagement with the webinar. So why don't we just jump into some questions? So one of the first questions is related to the purpose for the use of low and no calorie sweeteners. So are low and no calorie sweeteners only effective for body weight management under certain circumstances? And then can you also comment on this umbrella term for low and no calorie sweeteners when there are low calorie sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, zero calorie sweeteners, artificial sweeteners? There's a lot of different terms. So can you also talk about how those terms might affect results?
Yeah. So how low calorie sweeteners are intended to be used. I think these different randomized controlled trials address some of those different uses. I think in particular, whenever low calorie sweeteners are substituted for energetic sugars, that's when they're likely to have their greatest efficacy, and is really how they're intended to be used. We're not saying if you just throw low calorie sweeteners into your diet nonchalantly, that's going to help you with body weight. But when you're substituting low calorie sweeteners for sugars as part of an energy restricted diet, they can really be beneficial for helping control energy while still giving you that sweet treat. So as they're intended to be used, I think they can be beneficial when swapped with something like a sugar. As far as the different terms go, we're all talking about the same thing. So low calorie, a calorie is a unit of energy. So some people call them low energy sweeteners. They also tend to be referred to as high-intensity sweeteners, and that's because their sweetness is very intense when compared to something like sucrose. So something like sucralose can be like 400 to 800 times sweeter than sucrose when we were talking about a gram for gram basis. So if we're calling them low calorie, low energy, high intensity, fake sugars, as my husband likes to call them, as much as I tell them that's not the scientific term. In general, we're all talking about the same thing. There have been measures to try to get everyone to use the same common term, and they haven't always stuck. But while we call them all by the same name, they are distinct chemical compounds. They taste different. They bind to different receptors in the oral cavity and through the gastrointestinal tract. Some of them are metabolized like protein would, for example, aspartame, whereas other sweeteners end up going into circulation and can be excreted in the urine or the feces. So while they all go by the same name, they can have very different sweetness intensities, and they have very different metabolic rates. So we shouldn't expect them all to have the exact same effect on body weight.
Okay, and we had a couple of comments come through reinforcing that same idea that when low and no calorie sweeteners are used to replace sugar and in a calorie deficit, then the beneficial effects on body weight could be seen. Just using low and no calorie sweeteners, but then not changing your caloric intake, isn't really going to result in results. But to your last point related to the metabolic differences between sweeteners, a question has come in, is it appropriate to pool different sweeteners together? Wouldn't it be better if these studies looked at each sweetener separately to then examine their effects on body weight?
Yes, I agree that it would be best to look at specific sweeteners or classes of sweeteners that tend to act the same. Like those sweet proteins, you could probably group together if we wanted to look at specifically those with similar functional properties, although even sweet proteins vary quite widely. So I think it is important to look at specific sweeteners, but again, it goes back to that hypothesis that's being tested. If your hypothesis is that these sweeteners will act differently, then you should pair them against each other versus water or sucrose. But if you're really more interested in the effect of sweetness per se, then it may make more sense to lump these sweeteners together in your study. It all kind of depends on what's your question and what you're trying to ask.
Okay, and another question to build on the differences between these reviews. So this attendee is asking, the systematic reviews don't seem to come to different conclusions within study design, though it seems that mostly it's a difference in RCT versus cohort study. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. That makes me feel good that our figure was able to convey that message. The meta-analysis results that pool RCTs all generally come to the same conclusion, or at least in the direction of the effect. They all tend to be more beneficial or null, if you want to be more conservative. And the randomized control trials and the non-randomized studies are concluding adverse associations, but as you can see in some of our figures, not all of those systematic reviews actually observed a significant adverse direction of effect from their meta-analysis. So whether it's in the inherent nature of non-randomized studies, which it very well may be. When you conduct a meta-analysis of non-randomized studies, you're compounding the risk of residual confounding and really giving what looks like a very precise estimate with a small confidence interval, which really is more of just potentially a trick of the math than any sort of precision on the estimates that can be concluded. Because again, those studies are highly heterogeneous. So, it's potentially an issue with pooling non-randomized studies as part of a meta-analysis, or, potentially for those like inherent biases that are there with regard to the risk of low-calorie sweeteners, which tend to be supported with that non-randomized evidence.
Okay, and then going back to the WHO report, this attendee suggests that the WHO report authors suggest reverse causality is likely not the differentiating factor between RCTs and cohorts. They suggest it might be from the reasoning of use of non-sugar sweeteners, such as whether you're using it for weight loss, substituting for sugar. Do you have any comments, or do you agree with that?
Yeah. I think, first and foremost, we get the results from a systematic review. So like WHO and the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee kind of follow a similar process. They conduct a systematic review, and then the results from the systematic reviews are kind of chewed over, and then they end up spitting out a recommendation. And that chewing up part is where you kind of have this kind of like risk assessment that has to occur. And so as part of the WHO's review, their risk they perceived the risk of the potential for adverse effects based on those few randomized studies to be too high of a risk when individuals could be consuming something like water. That's their risk assessment. I could see that, and I could see it as low-calorie sweeteners can be valuable tools for individuals trying to maintain their body weight. So if you can swap out a diet soda for a sugar-sweetened beverage, I think that should be encouraged versus giving a population recommendations that they might not necessarily follow. They might see that and say, well, I shouldn't drink diet soda, so I might as well be drinking soda. And, that's just a really easy way to swap out up to sometimes like 500 calories a day just by making one dietary swap and still end up having that sweet treat. So I think, there's results from a systematic review, and then there's a dietary recommendation that comes out. And it all has to do with how they perceive risk when developing those recommendations. The other question was related to reverse causality, and I think we throw out the term reverse causality a lot, but I think it's important to really understand what we're actually saying there. So, reverse causality is that chicken or the egg? Is it an individual consumes a low-calorie sweetener, which then makes them gain weight, or an individual is gaining weight, which makes them use low-calorie sweeteners? The potential for reverse causality is a big risk when we're talking about cross-sectional research. So that's when you're assessing the exposure and the outcome at the same time point. As part of a prospective cohort study, it's not necessarily reverse causality because we are able to track individuals, and those high-quality reviews are able to, those high-quality studies are able to track changes over time. It's really more of the risk for residual confounding. So there could be other factors going on that leads an individual to choose to consume a low-calorie sweetener. The easiest example is an individual is pre-diabetic. So an individual with pre-diabetes is more likely to start consuming a low-calorie sweetened beverage. So if you're not controlling for diabetes risk when you're looking at low-calorie sweeteners and body weight, you have a risk for residual confounding, which can lead you, if you just look at the results at face value, could make you think low-calorie sweeteners lead to body weight gain, but it's really more of an individual becomes pre-diabetic, start to consume low-calorie sweeteners, and because they're pre-diabetic, they're also they tend to have a higher body weight. So it becomes like a complex relationship that you have to tease out. So with non-randomized studies, there's always a risk for residual confounding. There are better ways to handle it than others, which Andrew will do a fantastic job of explaining. But I think you can never rule out what is truly going on in some of those non-randomized studies, despite the best methods.
Okay, thank you. And then we have time for one more question. And this is, when doing observational research, how specific can one get regarding the types and amounts of sweeteners consumed? For example, can researchers use Higgins to determine that?
That is really difficult to do in non-randomized studies. Not only with a non-randomized study, you tend to ask someone to report what they're consuming. They barely remember what they consumed yesterday, let alone what specific sweetener they used. In some cases, you might be able to tease that out between specific consumers. So like someone who adds a sweetener to their coffee is going to grab the same color packet every single time, whether it's just out of habit or preference. So in very niche situations, you might be able to tease out effects of specific sweeteners. But in general, it becomes difficult. In addition, the sweeteners that are used in the food supply are often consumed in combination with each other. So you see a sulfame K partnered with sucralose or aspartame, because that synergistic effect leads to a sweetness profile that's closer to something like soup. So it's really difficult to tease out specific effects because they're often consumed in combination with each other. Things like certain nutrient databases do include information on ingredients, but again, even if you have that level of detail, those formulations change all the time, and so you really have the potential for misrepresenting that exposure. So it's really difficult to do. People have tried to tease it out, but I think it's really hard to identify that really quantitative exposure to specific sweeteners when doing those studies. So I kind of complained, and I hopefully didn't, but I don't know if I gave too many answers to how to better heat.
No, I think it's fascinating. And I think, thank you very much for sharing your research with us. It seems to have a lot of usefulness beyond just the subject of low and no calorie sweeteners, just for research design and how to interpret these systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. So I want to thank you again for your time. Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. I do want to, before we end for the day, invite our audience to join us for the IFINS Innovation Showcase, which is coming up December 10th, 11th, and 12th. We're currently accepting abstract submissions from startups to students, so please check out our website for more information. And I know that we weren't able to get to all of the questions from today's webinar, so if you have any specific questions that you'd like me to pass on to Kelly, you can reach out to me directly at tzecca@ifins.org, and please engage with IFINS through our website and social media platforms. So again, thank you very much for your attendance, and Kelly, for your fantastic presentation. And the recording will be available in a week or so on the IFINS website. Thank you so much. Have a great day.